We know U.S. immigration policy is bad because it defies the most common sense tenet of personal financial advice. Do not spend money or take on additional liabilities until you have an adequate emergency fund. The U.S. labor pool has no emergency fund. The vast majority of workers have no emergency fund. So why on earth would we want to grow the U.S. labor pool? We wouldn't want to do that, just like a financial coach wouldn't want a consumer they're advising to go out and buy a brand new BMW when they didn't have an emergency fund. Hello everyone. I've got 3 topics I'm going to cover today. The first is crowds of thousands of people have been drawn out to a Hispanic grocery store chain after it offers them $30 in free food. The second story I'm going to cover is how the New York Times is spitting on the grave of a beloved Trump-supporting Brooklyn bartender by trying to falsely blame his coronavirus death on Fox News. Finally, as a continuation to one of my videos last week, I'm going to give you my continued thoughts on the ongoing right-wing protest to reopen the economy. So the first news story is about a chain of Hispanic grocery stores called Megamart. If you don't live in the United States, I know this might be a weird concept, but Hispanic people have their own grocery stores, just like they listen to their own separate radio stations and watch their own separate TV channels. Megamart, from what I understand, is a chain of big box Hispanic grocery stores located in Maryland and possibly in other surrounding areas. Last Friday, Megamart offered to any customer who showed up at the store a free $30 worth of groceries. As a result, thousands of people queued up in lines that stretched for blocks and blocks and blocks. They huddled together in tightly packed lines waiting for an opportunity to enter the store to collect their free $30 worth of groceries. Now, I have to say, crowding together with hundreds of other people in tightly packed lines during a viral pandemic for 5 hours to get just $30 worth of food is not something anyone does willingly. That is an act of sheer desperation. At the point you're exposing yourself to hundreds of other people while you wait in line for hours and hours for such a meager amount of free food, you've run out of options at that point. So what's the deal with this? Why is this happening? Why is it a Hispanic grocery store chain? Well, if you're a laid off worker in the United States, one thing you most likely don't have to worry about is how you're going to feed yourself. That's because if you have no income, you can qualify for food stamps. That way, even during a period of time where you're unemployed due to the coronavirus, you still have food that you can eat. But if you're an illegal immigrant or you're a foreign national working in the United States on some sort of green card, then you're not entitled to U.S. welfare benefits. That means if you don't have any revenue coming in, you can't afford to eat. Of course, the vast majority of people who are going to find themselves in this situation are the sort of people who shop at Hispanic grocery stores. So here's what I don't understand. For years, we've been told that illegal immigration and mass immigration from Central and South American countries to the United States is essential, that these workers are essential, that they're doing the jobs that Americans refuse to do. I mean, you had this whole protest, which I believe was also part of a movie called A Day Without a Mexican, and the idea was that if we did not have all of these Mexican immigrants working, it would just cripple the United States. But lo and behold, our country goes into a crisis. All workers not deemed essential are let go. And look at what groups of people are no longer working. For years now, we've been told that these immigrants are self-sufficient, that they boost the United States GDP, that they pay taxes, and that they're an asset to the United States economy. But when I see these crowds of thousands of people waiting in crowded lines during a viral pandemic to get $30 worth of food, I start to question this narrative. Is mass migration an asset, or is it a massive liability at this point? Now, anyone familiar with basic concepts of financial planning, anyone who's received any sort of financial counseling whatsoever, should be well aware of the importance of some sort of emergency fund. As an individual consumer, any financial expert would advise you that before you buy some luxury good like a brand new car or an exotic vacation, you need to have enough money saved up in the bank to protect yourself in case you lose your job or experience some sort of financial emergency. Additionally, most financial experts will expect you to have some sort of plan in place on how you're going to retire and expect you to be contributing money towards some sort of future retirement plan. Now, there used to be a show on TV. I don't know if it's still on because I don't really watch TV anymore, but it was the Susie Orman show. People would call into this show and they would tell Susie Orman, this is how much money I make, this is how much I've saved up, this is how much I'm contributing towards my retirement. Would it be financially acceptable for me to then go and spend my money on a new house or whatever it is they wanted to buy? If the caller had adequate savings, if they were putting enough away towards retirement, then Susie Orman would approve them. They could go ahead and make this purchase. But majority of the time, the person didn't have enough of an emergency fund. They didn't have enough money saved away for retirement. So Susie Orman would tell them they're denied. It would be financially reckless for them to make that purchase. They needed to have an adequate emergency fund first. It's been well known for probably decades at this point that the majority of U.S. workers have no emergency fund. They live paycheck to paycheck. If they lose their job, if there's some sort of financial emergency, they're not going to be able to afford that. And that's even ignoring the issue of whether they've got anything saved for retirement, whether they've got health insurance, etc. So we've known for decades that the majority of U.S. workers live paycheck to paycheck. When it comes to U.S. immigration policy, did any of our lawmakers ever ask the question, does it make financial sense to bring in all of these people? Because in my view, immigration is a luxury. If the country is financially secure enough, if it can afford to bring in additional people, if the workers have emergency funds, if they're gonna be okay when there's an emergency, then okay, maybe it makes sense to bring in some additional people. But when most of your workers are living paycheck to paycheck, doesn't it seem strange that you would bring in additional workers? Doesn't it seem like that's like purchasing a luxury good at that point when you don't have enough money saved for an emergency fund? For years and years, the American people have had this idea shoved down their throats by people like Ben Shapiro that the United States desperately needs these workers, that we need 1 million immigrants every year to come to the United States, on top of the millions of illegal immigrants that also enter our country year after year, that these workers were necessary for the economy. But the second that a crisis hits, we no longer have jobs for these people. The best we have to offer them is $30 worth of free food from the Hispanic grocery store. The only catch being that they have to wait in line with hundreds of other people during a viral pandemic to get this $30 worth of free food. That's all we have for these people at this point. U.S. immigration policy is not wise and insightful. It's not consistent with long-term growth and economic success for Americans. It's the opposite of that. It's reckless, it's focused on generating short-term profits over long-term security, and artificially inflating our country's GDP. We know U.S. immigration policy is bad because it defies the most common sense tenet of personal financial advice. Do not spend money or take on additional liabilities until you have an adequate emergency fund. The U.S. labor pool has no emergency fund. The vast majority of workers have no emergency fund. So why on earth would we want to grow the U.S. labor pool? We wouldn't want to do that, just like a financial coach wouldn't want a consumer they're advising to go out and buy a brand new BMW when they didn't have an emergency fund. And it's been increasingly revealed that it's not just the U.S. worker in this situation. A huge number of U.S. businesses are apparently operating in a manner similar to paycheck to paycheck. They have no emergency fund. This practice is apparently widespread throughout the entire US economy. The fact that so many US workers and businesses fail to maintain a modest emergency fund is evidence of a deeper sickness in the US economy. And if the US economy is sick, it makes no sense for us to balloon the labor supply through mass immigration. No medical doctor would advise someone suffering from cancer that the solution to their problem would be to also become morbidly obese. Yet political pundits like Ben Shapiro constantly advocate for more immigration like it's going to somehow solve the underlying issues in the US economy. In reality, it's just going to cause other problems and make the underlying situation more difficult to deal with. Here's another question that I have. All of these people who risk their lives crowding together to get $30 worth of free food, how long is that $30 worth of food going to last them? Are we going to need to form these lines again in another week or two? Is the new normal going to be that during a viral pandemic that thousands of people crowd together in lines to receive $30 worth of free food? By permitting non-citizens to live in our country, are we being compassionate or are we being cruel at this point? Moving on, our next story is going to be about the New York Times. The New York Times, of course, is supposed to be our nation's paper of record, but in recent years, they've hired journalists that are openly racist, such as Sarah Jeong, and they've increasingly become a paper that parrots Trump derangement syndrome talking points as well as woke nonsense. A recent news article in the Times about a Brooklyn tavern owner named Joe Joyce falls into the former category. According to the New York Times article, Joe Joyce was the owner of a beloved tavern/bar in Brooklyn called JJ Bubbles. It was one of the few bars in the borough of Brooklyn which Trump supporters were welcomed at. Despite the fact that he was an open Trump supporter, the New York Times points out that Joe Joyce was not a bigot and that he proudly served gay people as well as ethnic minorities at the bar as well. Of course, only a newspaper like the New York Times would be so condescending to conservatives that it would assume the opposite would be true. So let's go over all of the lies involved in this New York Times article, because there's multiple layers of bullshit going on. According to the New York Times article, Joe Joyce watched Fox News, and Sean Hannity made a quote where he suggested that the coronavirus was a hoax. Because Joe Joyce trusted Sean Hannity, he decided to go on a cruise in Spain, ignoring the risk of coronavirus because Sean Hannity had said that it was a hoax. Upon returning to Brooklyn, Joe Joyce started suffering from the coronavirus, and ultimately he succumbed to the illness and passed away. Yes, everyone, apparently to the New York Times, Sean Hannity killed Joe Joyce. He's got blood on his hands. If it weren't for him dismissing the coronavirus as some sort of hoax, then Joe Joyce would be alive today. Of course, this is the false New York Times version of what happened, not what actually happened. Here's the first issue. The quote by Sean Hannity, where he links the coronavirus to a potential hoax, was made on March 9th. The date that Joe Joyce started his cruise in Spain was March 1st. So it's literally impossible for Joe Joyce's decision to go on this cruise to have been impacted at all by anything that Sean Hannity said. So that's the first lie, but it's even worse than that. Now, I'm no fan of Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity is a guy who shilled hard, one of the biggest shills for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars under the George W. Bush administration. I don't watch his show. I wouldn't trust anything that Sean Hannity says. However, to the extent that the New York Times is quoting him saying that coronavirus is a hoax, they're misrepresenting what Sean Hannity actually said. They're taking him entirely out of context. Sean Hannity never implied that the coronavirus was a hoax. He was indicating that there was a media hoax blaming the problem of coronavirus on Donald Trump. That it was Donald Trump's fault that coronavirus spread to America and that our country became the most afflicted in the world. The media has used this same lie, this same ability to take quotes out of context to say the same thing about President Donald Trump. Donald Trump also made a quote where he suggested that it was a hoax that the media was trying to blame his administration on the coronavirus. But at no point did either President Donald Trump or Sean Hannity ever say that the coronavirus itself was a hoax, even if they said certain sentences that taken out of context could be implied to say that. Anyone who actually heard their statements in full, though, would never reach those same conclusions. So that's two lies. For one, it's not even possible that Joe Joyce could have heard this Sean Hannity quote, but even if he did hear it somehow, if he had an ability to watch Fox News 1 week in the future, then he would have heard something entirely different than what this article implies that he heard. But two lies is not enough for the New York Times. There's another massive falsehood with this article. The article heavily implies that Joe Joyce contracted coronavirus from this cruise that he took in Spain. However, we all know in all of the cruises where passengers got coronavirus, they were covered heavily in the news media. If the people on Joe Joyce's cruise ship started showing signs of coronavirus, the cruise ship would not have been permitted to dock. It would have been an international news story. The struggle to find a European country willing to let passengers disembark in light of the coronavirus crisis would have been something covered by the media. Of course, none of this happened. Does that mean it's impossible that Joe Joyce contracted coronavirus from the cruise ship? I guess it's possible that due to the incubation period, he could have contracted it on one of the last few days of the cruise, but it seems unlikely. And the reason I say that is Joe Joyce started showing symptoms of suffering from the coronavirus when he was back in Brooklyn during the same period of time where everyone else in New York City started to experience symptoms. It seems like the most likely possibility is that he was infected around the same time that everyone else was infected in New York. He may have been infected working at his bar, shopping at the grocery store, or riding the subway around. If it weren't bad enough that the New York Times author who wrote this penned an article full of lies, it turns out that he happens to be an absolute hypocrite as well. While the New York Times reporter tries to blame Fox News and Sean Hannity for Joe Joyce's death because they downplayed the coronavirus, he tweeted the following on February 27th. I fundamentally don't understand the panic. Incidence of the disease is declining in China. What if there were people who read this New York Times reporter's tweet and they decided to go on cruises or they traveled for business to Europe? Does that mean the New York Times should be blamed for those people's deaths? By the logic of its own article, the answer to that question is yes. The New York Times is not a respectable news outlet worthy of being America's paper of record. Instead, it's a garbage fake news outlet that peddles false stories promoting Trump derangement syndrome and other woke nonsense. I am sure that Joe Joyce would not appreciate the New York Times using a false story about his death as a method of bashing Trump supporters. As transparent and obvious this would be to anyone, I still wouldn't hold my breath for any New York Times reporter to care. All right, the final thing that I wanted to talk about is the continued right-wing protest to reopen the economy, the continued spurging by right-wing pundits like Ben Shapiro, demanding that things reopen immediately. Probably the most popular argument I've seen these protesters and pundits make is that these stay-at-home orders issued by several state governors are unconstitutional. For example, last week, the governor of New Jersey appeared on Tucker Carlson's show. Tucker Carlson asked the governor repeatedly how he has the authority under the Bill of Rights to tell Americans that they cannot assemble at churches to worship next to one another. Of course, the governor of New Jersey is an idiot, and he was not able to articulate any sort of response to this question. The best he could muster is that his executive order had been vetted by attorneys. So is Tucker Carlson right? Are all of these stay-at-home orders egregious violations of people's constitutional rights? Unlike Sean Hannity, who I talked about earlier, I like Tucker Carlson. I mostly agree with what he says. but this is one instance where I do not. It's well established in US law that the government has the ability to suspend rights in a time of emergency. The clearest evidence that the Constitution allows this is in Article 1, Section 9, Provision 2. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus is the right of an American citizen who's being unlawfully incarcerated, jailed, or imprisoned to petition the federal courts for an order that they be released. If during a rebellion or invasion, the U.S. Constitution finds that it's entirely acceptable for a government to incarcerate someone indefinitely with no due process, then it's fair to say that a stay-at-home order during a pandemic meets the requirements of a U.S. Constitution. Now, as I said in my video last week, U.S. history is full of examples where this has happened. The example I used in my video last week was the draft riots in New York City, which resulted in a military occupation of the city and martial law. If you're interested in other times, you can search the wiki page for martial law in the United States, and you will see that there were many times where U.S. constitutional rights were temporarily suspended because the United States was dealing with an emergency. If these stay-at-home orders really did egregiously violate the U.S. Constitution, then why have none of them been struck down in any U.S. court for being unconstitutional? If it were really that legally obvious and clear-cut that these stay-at-home orders were unconstitutional, why have they not been successfully overturned or challenged anywhere in the country? I mean, Ben Shapiro is a lawyer, right? He does realize that if there was any legal argument that these were unconstitutional, that all that would have to happen is some business or individual affected by the stay-at-home order, all they would have to do is challenge it in court. Yet not one of these stay-at-home orders has been overturned for being unconstitutional. This remains the case despite the fact that millions of businesses have been impacted. This has hurt the bottom line of huge banks, mega corporations, millionaires and billionaires, the most powerful people in this country. This is despite the fact that our culture is incredibly litigious. Every time Donald Trump would do anything involving immigration, there would be 5,000 lawsuits by the ACLU. But Ben Shapiro, a licensed attorney with a straight face, wants you to believe that these stay-at-home orders are blatantly unconstitutional, that the second a lawsuit is filed, that they'll fold like a stack of cards. Don't be deceived by this nonsense. Even if these conservatives manage to get the stay-at-home orders reversed, and the economy supposedly is going to reopen, unless coronavirus is under control, what kind of economy do they think they're getting back? You may be real eager to work as a bartender, but if the economy reopens and no one ends up going to your bar because they're afraid of getting the coronavirus, well, you're not going to be working that bartender job for very long, are you? Now, right now, everything that's not essential is shut down. You're not going to get evicted from your apartment because you can't pay rent. I mean, literally, landlords can't file eviction lawsuits because those aren't going to be considered essential. The courts aren't open to those lawsuits right now. But if America reopens to a shitty economy, one where consumers are terrified to spend money, terrified to leave their house, then that's going to put a lot of people in a bad position. As a bartender, you're still not going to be able to pay your rent, except now your landlord can evict you because the courts are back open. Is that really what you want? Now, I get the whole conservative pull yourself up by the bootstraps thing. In normal circumstances, I would rather see people work for money than be given money for nothing. I think it's better that people be self-dependent than dependent on the government to take care of them. However, the current crisis was caused by failures of our government leaders in the U.S. neoliberal ruling class. Speaking strictly figuratively here, these people need a bit of a bloody nose or a kick to the groin. At a time like this, we need conservatives who are not doormats. We need conservatives who are not going to let the neoliberal elite escape responsibility and walk all over them. If you want to be that type of doormat conservative, then go ahead. Listen to Ben Shapiro. Go back to work during the viral pandemic. Put the risk of yourself and your family at risk so you can generate profits that disproportionately go to the neoliberal ruling class. Continue to pay your rents and mortgages to these massive banks that just received the biggest bailout in U.S. history, while consumers and small businesses receive peanuts. Continue to pay taxes to governments that were completely impotent in the face of this virus, that seem to have routinely for years put the interest of foreign nationals immigrating to the United States or the working class in China over the interest of American citizens. If that's what it means to you to be a conservative, then by all means do all of those things. Do your part to help conserve the rotten core at the center of U.S. society and government policy. I myself will hope to stay at home as long as possible, even if it means that I'm not generating income, paying taxes, or making my mortgage payments. I will spend more time with my family and getting better educated about things by reading books. And as the many liberal governments that exist in the United States, as well as the neoliberal managerial class, is slowly bled dry from this, I look forward to finally emerging from my house into a United States that's at the beginning of a pivot towards a post-neoliberal society. Because any conservative who isn't completely brain dead at this point should have come to the conclusion that there's nothing worth conserving about Western neoliberalism. Anyways, that's all I've got to talk about. I hope you enjoyed this content. Hopefully I'll have another video up tomorrow. If you're not subscribed to this YouTube channel, please subscribe.